All right, we're going to go ahead and get started tonight. I apologize, we're running a little bit late, and the printer's not working, so I don't have handouts for you. Sorry about that. So, and I did not anticipate that, so I'm going to have to just verbally tell you the discussion questions tonight, and you'll just have to be good listeners, okay? Tonight we're gonna take a little bit of a turn, go a little bit further back in the timeline. So obviously we spent the last few weeks really talking about children, adoption, abortion, IVF, all this kind of stuff, really heavy topics. Tonight, hopefully, will be a little bit of a lighter subject, but we're really continuing to move back in just the legal landscape of how we've thought about the family unit in our nation. We're actually going to be talking about family representation tonight, looking at we're going to spend a lot of time talking about voting rights in the United States and how that's shifted over the last couple of centuries, as well as just how we viewed covenant responsibility within the household. So really just to kind of review from the last few weeks, because one of the things that we started out really strong in, then the last couple of weeks we spent almost no time in, is actually just talking about the legal landscape of what practical implications that has looked like in the United States over the last few years. And so I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about that. So if you'll remember, last week we talked about birth control. It really began to shift in the United States starting in about the 1930s. And the first denomination, first Christian denomination to take a permissive stance on any kind of birth control was in the year 1930. The Anglican Church permitted it for married couples. And pretty quickly, within about the next 15 to 20 years, almost every major denomination in the United States made some form of allowance for artificial birth control. But it really wasn't until the 1960s when the FDA finally gave approval to the pill, where we really saw the legal ramifications of widespread dispersal of birth control. And then in 1965, there's a court case called Griswold versus Connecticut. And that was the case where the Supreme Court struck down a state's right to prohibit birth control for married couples. And it created the term that we call a right to privacy. Now, there was no, up until that point, that was not something that we thought about. But that court decision was really where we began to detach sexual behavior from marriage and eventually children as well. 1969 is when we saw the first no-fault divorce law passed in California under Ronald Reagan when he was governor. And that really just further dissolved what was formerly viewed as a really sacred contract, or a sacred covenant, I should say, between a husband and wife, now became a contract that was dissolvable at will by only one party in the marriage. And so pretty quickly after that, in 1973, we saw the Roe v. Wade decision come down, which expanded the right to privacy to include nationwide abortion, and it established the individual's choice, the mother's choice in making those decisions without parental or spousal notification. Okay, so these were some of the major kind of legal landmarks that have led us on the road that we've talked about so far today. But tonight, we're going to go just a little bit further back to how the family was represented even before 1930. And I do apologize. I'm going to try printing one more time while you guys are discussing these questions. But I've got two questions for you guys. Actually three, but I only put it in two lists, two numbers. So, one, is it important for Christians to vote? And two, is it important for every eligible citizen to vote? Then the third question is, in what ways was voting restricted at America's founding, and why? Why did the founders make those restrictions? Okay, so you can use Google; it's allowed. But take a few minutes, talk about that. Do Christians have an obligation to vote? Do citizens have an obligation to vote? And why was voting restricted the way it was at America's founding? Okay? Go for it. All right. So hopefully these questions were not too difficult to answer. But what do we think? Is it important for Christians to vote? Yes. Yes. Okay. Is it important for every citizen to vote? Yes. Yes. Okay. Easy peasy. What ways, and we're actually going to spend a lot of time talking about this, so just throw out a couple of things. How was voting restricted at the country's founding? Men and landowners, okay, yeah. Yeah, white men. Not necessarily Christian men, although there's an element to that, that's true. But yeah, anything else did you guys find? Okay. Why did they have those types of restrictions, do you think? Yeah, that's a great answer. And we're gonna spend some real time talking through that. But that leads me to the next point. I want to spend some time looking at what is the actual biblical foundation. Now, obviously, we don't live in a theocracy. We are not ancient Israel, and ancient Israel was not a republic. And so we can't say, oh, yeah, we are living the way God designed government to be. But that being said, the book most often cited by the founding fathers when they were writing up a lot of these government documents and figuring out how to run the country was Deuteronomy. They quoted the Torah, God's word, far, far more than any other source, including John Locke or any of those famous names that you've ever heard of. They were much more concerned about how did God set up his people to run their nation. And so we're going to spend some time looking at that, looking at a few different aspects that we implemented in the United States as we became a nation. So the main thing that I want you to see as we read through these passages is that Israel was not a democracy, right? There was no such thing as voting rights in ancient Israel. However, God interacts with mankind through covenants. And through people were represented in those covenants, not as individuals, but as members of households, members of families and tribes. And so anytime you see a lineage given, that's establishing their household, their tribe, of where do they come from, how ought they be represented. That was why it was so important to them, is because they were represented based on who they belonged to, right? And so, and just like Tony said a moment ago, fathers were called to be those representatives of their household. And on a larger scale, elders acted as representatives of their tribes. And so a particularly influential or powerful family would be selected to represent a group of households, usually from a common descent. And so I want to read through a couple of passages again. If you've got Church Center in the handout, you can see these passages. I've also put a few comments under each passage. But if you'll read through Exodus 18, Numbers 1, Numbers 30, and Numbers 27, we're just going to highlight, you really would have to read like Genesis through Deuteronomy if you wanted to get a full scope really, and even beyond that, to get a full scope of how Israel's government worked and how their legal system and judicial system was set up. But these are just a couple of the highlights about how people were represented in Israel. So just take a few minutes. Again, we're going to discuss them together, but read through those passages. If somebody at your table has Church Center, read through the comments. Take just like a minute or two to give your thoughts, then we'll come back together, okay? So, pretty interesting passages. Who learned something new about ancient Israel reading these passages? These, I think, are really informative in the way families were counted and represented. There's quite a few other passages that we could have looked at that give you a little bit more insight, but I thought these were particularly helpful. So, that first passage here, we really just see the general form of representation that, to a large degree, we see reflected in our own government system, right? With representatives and senators and all this kind of stuff on the national level, and then more so on the local level with towns and counties and all that kind of stuff, right? We see that we start with family leaders, and then local representatives, and another layer of representatives, and we move kind of up the chain, right? So I think that was really helpful. And then in Numbers 2, we see how the census of Israel was conducted according to family lineages, which was really important to belong to your father's household. They did not count how many kids you had, right? Well, they did, but not for that reason. And the Numbers 30 passage, this one I found really interesting. Just talking about how vows and legally who was ultimately responsible for everything in the family, right? That at an ultimate level, everything came back to the father, right? So if a wife or a daughter, and I could be mistaken. It doesn't necessarily say this, but I believe it would also apply to a son who was still not of age. Yeah, not hasn't gone to his own household yet. That the father was responsible, and not only responsible for the things he did, but the things that he didn't do, right? If he didn't say, no, you can't do that, then it was on him, right? And the legal ramifications, the financial ramifications, they didn't fall on the woman, they fell on the man, right? So I thought that was really interesting to see how that held out. Then we do see in that last passage an exception to the general working of the system, right? That in the event that there is no male leader of the household, that a woman could take up that mantle, right? At least temporarily until there was a male heir to inherit it, right? And so I thought these were just all really insightful and very closely reflected in the early American system. And so now it is worth modeling that or mentioning that the founding fathers didn't invent everything that they put into practice, right? They were very careful to cite and found a lot of our systems directly from Scripture, but they were also coming from a long legal tradition called English common law. And so a lot of the traditions about, how our court systems work with appeals and representation and all that stuff, they're pulling from a long Western tradition, but even that common law tradition was really developed in the Christian state, in what's called Christendom, where the state religion, the vast majority religion of the population was Christianity. And so it doesn't mean that it was a perfect system by any means, but they were heavily pulling from a scriptural basis when they were putting this kind of stuff together. Now, it's also worth mentioning that the U.S. Constitution did not establish a national standard for voting rights. Outside of what happened directly in Congress, it really left it to each individual state to decide how they were going to choose their representatives, how they were going to hold the vote, right? And so anytime we talk about, well, how did they vote in the very early years of the country, you have to understand that every state had its own system. And so to some degree, we have to make a little bit of a generalization. There's probably fine points in every state. But for the most part, by and large, all of the states generally restricted voting rights to somebody called a freeholder, which would have been a free citizen in the United States who owned land, or sometimes it was tied to having a certain amount of wealth. You had to have, well, that monetary wealth gets complicated too because we didn't have legal tender back then, but they had to own a certain amount of stuff in order to be eligible to vote, right? And there was also a doctrine called coverture. And coverture simply refers to this concept that we've been talking about where the household is covered by the head of the household. That a spouse especially, but also their children, their slaves, everybody in that household was represented by the head of that household, right? It was not that, it often gets attacked as, well, we only wanted rich white people to vote, right? But that's not the case. They didn't think of voting as something that was afforded to particular individuals. They thought of voting in terms of household representation, and the head of that household was the one who cast the vote. It's also interesting, and this is something that I really learned a lot about as I was preparing for this class, and how people actually cast votes. So again, generally speaking, there was no such thing as absentee voting. There's no mail-in votes. You could not, if you weren't physically present at the voting place, you didn't get a vote. You also, they practiced, there's maybe you know the term for it, Robbie, but they voted vocally in public. Yeah, I saw the term, but it was, some Latin, and I didn't know how to pronounce it. So, but yeah, they would all, kind of like Congress does, right? They would all come into a room, and they would call for the vote, and everybody would say yay or nay, right? They did it publicly. There was no secret ballots in the United States in the very early years. And to some degree, and there's a lot of pros and cons to this, but to some degree that meant that head of household was held accountable, right? That everybody knew what you were voting for, and that all of the people you were representing knew how you voted as well, right? And so that's, I think, an important point here. There was at least one exception at the founding in New Jersey. New Jersey allowed all property-owning heads of household to vote. So that meant if there was a widow or an unmarried woman who, through however that may have happened, ended up owning their own property, it meant that they were eligible to vote. Now, that would be fairly uncommon in a situation other than being a widow. So technically, women were allowed to vote even at the founding in New Jersey. But again, it was tied to property rights, and married couples were under that coverture language, so that property belonged to the husband as the head of the house. So the question is, why did early Americans restrict voting to landowners and households? And there's a lot of reasons they did this. Um, One reason was that they believed that owning property gave people a certain independence from coercion. And so land ownership meant that you had at least some degree of economic independence. They feared that propertyless men would be easily bought, threatened, or manipulated by employers or patrons. And so the idea was if you owned property, generally that was agricultural property, you were responsible for your own living, which would make it much more difficult for a single individual to say, hey, if you don't vote this way in the next election, your rent's going up, because it's public voting, right? And so they believe that owning your own property gave you a certain amount of independence. They also believed that owning land gave you a more or less permanent stake in the community. Land's not mobile. You couldn't easily pack up and leave if bad laws were passed. And so landowners had the responsibility to live with the long-term consequences of their votes. So I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, we don't want a bunch of foreigners voting, right? But it's worth noting, especially in the very beginning of our country, how do you determine who's an American citizen, right? Everybody's there. They're all foreigners, right? And so how do you figure out, okay, who gets to actually vote here? Well, if you own land, that means you've made a pretty significant commitment that you're here to stay, right? You're an American citizen, not just here for a few months and going back to England or wherever you're from, right? And so they believe that land ownership gave you a permanent stake. They also believed that it afforded you a certain protection against majority tyranny. So Alexander Hamilton, for example, argued that the propertyless majority would use the ballot to vote for the redistribution of wealth and property. And they believed that linking voting to land protected property rights. So if you owned property, you were much less likely to vote for redistributing property to everybody, right? And I thought that was a really important thing to protect. Yeah.
They didn't own a quarter-acre lot in town. They owned acres of land.
Sure, yeah. And I mean, and a lot of them weren't necessarily wealthy in the very beginning, right? But they did own, yeah. And so, yeah, they were certainly more wealthy than people who didn't own anything, right? So, yeah, for sure. They also believed that owning land, you didn't just own property for the fun of it, like we do. I mean, today, like, it's the American dream, right, to own your own house, right? But back then, you didn't just buy a house just to buy a house. You bought property in order to use it for industry, right? And so they believed that owning property was somewhat of a test of character and competence, that if you were able to maintain and turn a profit on your estate, that was viewed as a sort of practical test for maturity, self-discipline, and sort of a baseline competence for the ability to vote, right? And so those are just some of the reasons that they had for tying those things together. They didn't want every individual to have the right to vote. And they really thought of it as the right of a household to represent before the community, not an individual. Now, those restrictions began to shift pretty quickly, really within a single generation, as early as the 1820s, 1770. 1789, really, I guess, for the Constitution. By the 1820s, something significant started to shift industry in the United States. What happened in that time period? Is the Industrial Revolution. Okay. So what started happening is a significant portion of the population stopped being agricultural, and they started moving into the city to work in factories, which meant a significantly lower percentage of the population actually owned property. And so as the Industrial Revolution progressed and families moved away from farms and into cities, there was this populist movement, I don't know if he was the leader of it, but he kind of paved the way. Andrew Jackson really heavily influenced a lot of states to drop that land ownership requirement somewhere between the 1820s and 1850s. But even then, they still really viewed voting as something that belonged to the head of the household, even if there was no land or property attached to it, that the head of the household still was providing for and representing his family in that process. And that's the way it was for a little while until we come up to about the Civil War in the 1860s. And in the Civil War is really the first time when we see voting get pushed as something that belongs to individuals rather than to a household. And so most of you probably learned it, at some point in high school, that if a man's old enough to fight for his country, then he's old enough to vote, right? And so this is where we really saw the push to allow young men who were signing up, fighting and dying for their state, in most cases, rather, but for the country, to have the right to vote. And so, like I said, this was really the first major step that we saw to grant an individual, regardless of whether and what household they belong to have the right to vote. After that happened in the 1860s, about the 1880s and 1890s, because again, this is happening gradually from state to state to state to state, generally not on the national level. We start to see states adopt the secret ballot like we have today, where instead of everybody standing in a room and vocally casting their vote, now that it has become more of an individual thing that's going on, rather than a household representative, we see the introduction of secret ballots. And it really privatized the act of voting. And to some degree, whether it was a good or a bad thing, it removed public and familial accountability from the ballot box. No one could truly know how you voted on a secret ballot. So that happened in the late 1800s. And then as we move into the 1920s, we see this movement of first wave feminism and women's suffrage. So after the Civil War, when we started really representing this idea of individuals voting instead of households voting, we got to the 1920s and women said, well, what the heck? If individuals are voting, why aren't women voting? We're individuals too, right? And so we start to see this really significant shift where we're no longer voting as households, but that men and women, even a married couple, were independent moral agents who might have different political priorities and might differ from one another, even within the household. And so this is really the last dying breath of that concept of coverture, where the head of the household is representing his family in a legal way through voting. So the passage of the 19th Amendment really changed that. And the government ceased to see marriage as something that really bound a husband and wife together in a covenant kind of one flesh way. So that's sort of the history of voting. And later on, we passed another amendment to include to lower the voting age from 21 to 18. That again plays into the household thing that originally it was thought that a man needed to establish a household, right, to have the right to vote, but we didn't think in those terms anymore. So as they turned 18 and were eligible to serve again in war, that they ought to be eligible to vote. So what's the point of even talking about all this stuff, right? What do we do with this information? One, I think it's just really informative to see how over the course of American history, right or wrong, Americans have really shifted their understanding of what a marriage and a covenant and a head of household means, right? We really embraced individualism, and that every single human being in a household is an independent figure, an independent citizen, beholden to no one else, right? And I think that's very informative in the way that we think about our legal rights, our representation. And so given what we've read about and seen, how ought we respond? So I think it's really important, first of all, to just encourage husbands and fathers to recognize that regardless of your legal standing in the United States, every husband and father, according to God's word, is called to be a covenant representative and head of his household. It's his duty to lead and represent his family spiritually, civically, and socially before God and men. And so I think often we see men back off from their responsibility to guide, serve, protect, lead their families because we've been trained. We've mentioned it several times in past lessons, right? That the law is a teacher. It teaches us how to think, how to act, how to behave. And so I think a lot of men neglect to talk about politics with their spouse, to talk about church and what we believe and what we don't believe, and what we're going to stand up for and what we're going to prioritize, because we think of these things as independent people, that you can have your priorities and I'll have my priorities, and we'll just kind of mix in the meet in the middle, right? But husbands and fathers need to take responsibility for those things. Now, that doesn't mean that men are the only ones responsible to use their civic rights, like voting, because we don't live in a culture that thinks that way anymore, or recognizes those rights. So today, because the law grants individual voting rights to women and all adults 18 and up, regardless of their household standing, I believe that especially Christians ought to exercise that civic privilege. However, I do believe that Christian families ought to come to a consensus because of the covenant that God has placed them under, the head of their household, and because of the responsibility of that head of the household to represent his family. The family needs to come to a consensus on how they're going to vote, on how they're going to represent their family in the community, in their church, and in public in general. So again, there's two sides to that, right? If you're representing, it's important to recognize what the people you're representing think and believe, right? But it's also important to recognize that you have if you're not the father and the husband, you also have an obligation to submit to the authority of the head of your household. And so it's important to come to a consensus on these things. So I just did a lot of talking, and on a lot of history, and throwing a lot of information at you. But hopefully none of this was shocking information to you, right? This has been a very slow development throughout American history, and I do hope that I'm asking the right questions to make you think about how your family, your marriage, your children are being represented, and to interact with what God expects in those settings. So there's a couple discussion questions here that I'd like to spend the rest of our time discussing. How should your Christian faith directly affect how and when you vote? And where do your civic duty and your Christian duty intersect? And how does learning about voting and family representation and how they were viewed in the past inform and change how you think about voting today? So take the last few minutes, talk about those discussion questions, and then if you get to the end of those couple of questions, read through the prayer prompts and take some time to pray. If you don't get to them, pray over those things as you go home tonight, all right? All right. Thank you, guys.